Okay, Rob, let's just keep it real. And, listeners, it's been however many episodes it's been. And there are so many of you, it would be impossible to thank you individually. But thank you for your loyal listenership. And we have a very modest request for you.
So what we would love is if you would be willing to help us get the word out about Sweet Valley Hive. You can rate us on iTunes or Spotify or wherever you're listening to us right now.
I'm going to pause you, Robert, because I think what's happening is it's going for them in one ear, out the other. I need to break through the noise right now and tell you freaking people, and it's millions of you I know I'm speaking to. And that's why we need your help to spread the word about it.
Because there are already millions of you. So we need to be at the billion.
We need billions. Okay, right now only 200 of them is on our Instagram. So here's the thing. It will take you 5 seconds. Okay, literally just do it right now. Go on your little app, press your little stars. If we made you have a little giggle, okay, if we said something that made you say, if we said something that made you say something to milk and clean.
If we've pushed you into the realm of analysis, as we so often do.
Go ahead, give us little stars, give us the nice reviews, and go to our Instagram at Sweet Valley Hive and follow it.
Hit that V, Hive.
Because if you are listening to this podcast, you must know that on the Instagram, we have all kinds of extra textual content that really enhances the experience exponentially to where it's utter foolishness that we're doing it for free on that Instagram. Go ahead and follow that. And then if you are moved to, spread the word, okay? Reshare our stuff on your Instagram. Tell your friends, pass a note in class. You're walking by a neighbor, you want an excuse to start a conversation and make friends in your community. Say, hey, guess what? Guess what I listened to?
Maybe you're laughing out loud to yourself on the subway and you notice people are looking at you strangely. Why not kind of blossom in their very eyes and say, I see you noticing that I'm laughing out loud. Join me and follow Sweet Valley Hive.
Or get one of those teachers says, ask me about my new God, or have you heard about Jesus? And that could just be an entry point. Get their attention, their attention and turn the conversation Sweet Valley High. You're interested in faith?
That's not it. Do not do that.
All right. Anything else we need from these people?
All I would say is, as RuPaul says, if you're not following Sweet Valley Hive on Instagram, you're only getting half the podcast.
Look right into your podcast app. You'll see there's a discourse happening. Is this book a masterpiece or problematic? One's a lifelong diehard fan, the other's a first-time reader. Both are really smart and funny and attractive. Sweet Valley, Sweet Valley High. Talking trends and hierarchy. Sweet Valley, Sweet Valley High. Relentless focus on their bodies. Sweet Valley, Sweet Valley High. What do they mean by all Americans? Sweet Valley, Sweet Valley High. No sex, just titillation.
Oh, night. Oh, sorry. Hello. Hi there.
Hi, Katie.
Hello. How are you?
Good. Sorry for my tardiness. Should we get into Sweet Valley High number 12, When Love Dies?
When Love Dies.
Should we start with the cliffhanger?
So we ended our last book with the following. Poor Stephen. Elizabeth wished there was some way she could comfort him, but the truth was, she felt just as uncertain about Trisha's feelings as Stephen did at this moment. As much as Elizabeth liked Trisha, she couldn't help wondering if there was some truth in what Jessica was suggesting. Why else would Trisha be acting so secretive? On the other hand, her recent experience with Suzanne had taught her that appearances could be deceiving. It was best not to form judgments based on superficial evidence. You can't be sure of anything until you talk to Trisha, Elizabeth said gently. Stephen was close to tears. I've tried. But she says nothing is wrong. Liz, I know she's hiding something. I can see it in her eyes, and it's driving me crazy. What terrible secret is Trisha keeping from Stephen? Find out in Sweet Valley number 12, When Love Dies.
so their brother Steven, the girlfriend Trisha has been like avoiding him and so on, and like no one really knows what's going on. And Jessica has been suggesting that maybe she's cheating with someone else.
So I think for me, the fundamental issue with When Love Dies is I don't care but at all about Trisha. So if she's cheating, cool. If she dies, sorry, my condolences, but cool. And I feel like the whole stakes of this book are like, why do we care if Steven and Trisha are together?
Hmm.
Do you share me at all with that? Or do you like, are you big into Trisha and this was like very emotional for you?
I'm not big into Trisha. You know, we never got to know Trisha enough to really become invested in her. So I don't care about the characters, but the story I still found emotionally compelling because of how, like, because the themes that it speaks to, I think, are quite universal and also touch aspects of the other characters' experience too. Do I particularly care if Trisha and Steven live or die? No.
Okay. Well, should we get into plot summary? Trisha has leukemia, but doesn't want to tell Steven because she doesn't want to burden him with it. So she secretly suffers in silence until Elizabeth finds out she has leukemia because she's going to get chemo. Also, Elizabeth gets kidnapped by a random guy.
You didn't leave me anything. I was supposed to get the kidnapped part. That's fine because it happens at the end.
Fine. Also,
that was so rude.
And I haven't said the other thing, so I'm going to end with she's hiding it, but Elizabeth finds out because she's a candy stripper at the hospital.
Yeah, so Elizabeth and Jessica become candy strippers, and I do think you said strippers, and that is a fruity slip.
I don't think I did, but I would love to have. Every time I read that word, I was like, stripper or striper?
So Elizabeth and Jess have become candy strippers at the hospital because Liz doesn't know this, but the reason is Jessica's trying to meet this celebrity called Jeremy Frank, and there ends up being some hijinks around that. But yeah, the point is this gives them a reason to be at the hospital. So Elizabeth finds out about Trisha. And then the other thing that happens is we get introduced to a little bit of a creeper called Carl, who's just sort of lurking in the shadows and creeping at Elizabeth all the time. She's like, I have a funny feeling about him, but I guess he's just a loner. And then the book ends with chloroform, and she's kidnapped by Carl.
Yeah. For me,
and the reason I couldn't tell you the name of the next book is because the name of the next book is called Kidnapped!
Yeah, I figured that it had to be something like that. So,
but like, wasn't that so random in this book about like the dying of cancer thing? And then you're like, oh, well, now we have there's the cancer plot, and that's like so heavy. So, okay, they give us comic relief with the hijinks at the hospital, Jeremy Frank, supposedly, even though it's very fucked up and we will get into it.
Thank you.
But then it's like, okay, I didn't realize we also then were bringing in creeper called Carl and ending with a kidnap. I'm like, that's a lot for one book.
It's too much and too little for one book. I don't care about Trisha and Steven. So that whole A plot, I was like, die or don't die, whatever. I don't care about a full-grown adult and the fact that Jessica has a crush on him. So that was like hijinks, but not that interesting to me. And then Carl, at the very beginning, from the first moment, you're like, oh, he's going to do something terrible to her. And then he does. So it just felt like a little too little for me.
I think I share your reaction in the sense of like, I didn't sort of connect to it was a little bit weird jimble-jamble that's weird to sort of like connect to, but I still found it interesting. I still took a bunch of not a million, but I have a bunch of notes and a bunch of thoughts on it, and like I found it interesting. So
I do agree that it's very difficult to describe this book without using the phrase jimble-jamble. Try and describe this book without saying jimble-jamble. I dare you. You can't.
I mean, do we want to get into the cover? I mean, in the title and the taglines?
Sure. I just want to say, it's not that I took nothing from the book. It's just, I think I loved TBT, Too Good to Be True, so much. I mean, I famously double read it. Like, it was just like the pinnacle of artistic excellence for me. So this was just a real come down, so to speak.
Oh my gosh. Okay, well.
And sorry. Can I say one more thing? Sorry. Please. Although it was a real come down from Too Good to Be True, it was still an enjoyable read. It was still fun. I'm being very negative here because I have such high standards for my girls, but this is still great.
No, I appreciate that and I receive that. And I think most of what I probably got out of it has to do with grief stuff. And that is probably a lot of what will bring to the conversation. So
I will say that as I was reading this, I did think like, oh, I'm glad that Pardo is a death doula and like we'll be able to bring to bear that on this conversation, because my vibe is just like, I don't want to talk about death. I don't want to think about death. So I was very grateful that you would kind of bring that additional perspective and insight. Should I describe my dream about this book or no?
Oh, I didn't realize it was about this. Please.
So I read the first half of this book before bed and then went to bed. And when I slept, and I don't normally remember my dreams, I'm not like a big dream kid, I happened to dream about my beloved great uncle, Uncle Herbie, for those of you listening who may know Uncle Herbie, who passed away in 2021 from complications from COVID. And in my dream, I like come upon him, although he was bald when I knew him, but I have pictures of him from when he was younger and he had a full head of hair. And I come upon him when he has a full head of hair and he is reading a Sweet Valley High book. And
This one?
I can't confirm or deny which book it was, but he said something. He was like a very, very sweet and gentle and lovely man. And he said something like very sweet and gentle about Sweet Valley and how much he like loved the books.
Robert.
Yeah.
I had no idea that's where we were going with this.
That was my dream.
Thank you. First of all, thank you so much for sharing that. And I think that's actually so powerful. Did you interpret it in any certain kind of way?
I
Did
didn't.
you feel safe sharing?
I didn't really. I mean, I'd like texted his daughter, who's my aunt, and was like, "Oh, I thought about your dad, like, you know, thinking of you." But I didn't. There was no real there was no interpretation whatsoever. Do you have interpretations?
Well, yeah, I can tell you objectively, he was telling you that we need to probably put some money into ad buys and work on kind of our marketing, I think. No, but jokes aside, I'm glad he likes it. Let's put it that way.
Me too. He was such a sweet man. Okay, sorry. So that's kind of where I enter into the text.
And why don't we, we talk about dedications. Why don't we dedicate this one to Herbie?
Oh, this one's for you, Uncle Herbie. That makes me feel a little weird, depending on what we say moving forward, but we'll see.
Let's talk about fucking.
Yeah, exactly.
And we can delete. I can delete the dedication.
Should we get to that cover?
Oh. Yeah, but how about first you guess the taglines? I liked when we did that last time.
Well, I don't think it can say anything specifically about death because they don't want to. I think it's going to be something like, are Steven and Trisha headed for disaster? And like, can their love survive this great test?
Okay, so the one on the cover, what terrible secret is Trisha keeping from Steven? ?
That's mean.
But the one on the back, Robert, and this is one that makes me say clear your schedule. I mean, do you want to even venture a guess?
No.
I mean, this one's the end of romance. ...
Huh. My schedule doesn't need to be cleared from my perspective. Why should I be clearing it?
Okay, well, this is going to lead me into a reading I have, which is when I first saw that, the end of romance, I thought it was kind of another way of saying the end of love, so I thought it was basically a sort of paraphrasing of the title, when love dies, the end of love. Okay, well, we can't say love again, let's say romance. But then when I read the book, I had another reading of it, which is one of the things I thought was interesting in the book is that there's this whole conversation around Jess. After she sees the movie Love Story, it's referred to that in the past she has a fantasy of having a romantic incurable disease. And she goes around sort of fainting for her guys that she's pursuing. And then there's a joke about how they're like, oh God, are you sick? And then she's like, stops doing it or something. I think that in some ways the end of romance might mean the end of romanticization of death. Because what I learned when I did some research on Love Story, which is about a couple with a big class difference and the girl's dying and he doesn't tell her she's actually dying. So the guy actually knows because the doctor told him, doesn't tell the partner that she's dying, okay? And one of the critiques of this, the movie was critiqued for a depiction of the illness as quote unquote old movie disease that causes the patient to become more beautiful by the minute. And so this question of romantic, idealized fantasy sort of versions around what illness and dying might look like. I think when it says the end of romance, I think it might also mean the end of the romanticization of death for some of these kids. Part of what is interesting to look at in this book is like, do we get the old movie disease version of Trisha, or do we get the sort of real version of what illness dying look like. And I think there's a tension there. A lot of our story is about like Trisha's grief and the way that she's maybe has a tension between being this sort of idealized dying person versus what it actually is to die.
That I think is very, very interesting. You did mention that Jessica is going to have to reckon with all of this. I think that reckoning will be delayed because, of course, her twin sister is kidnapped. And so she'll probably be more focused on that for a little bit. But
yeah, it's hard to hold this all in my head. It's hard to remember that, like, oh yeah, she's dying. Oh, but then Elizabeth's kidnapped, so we can't think about that right now because where's Elizabeth? She's in a
bigger fish to fry, unfortunately. Would love to do that reckoning. I need to see the cover. Take me to that couvert.
I just have to say, and I mean, I say this a lot, but this one really is a doozy.
Yeah, you've never not said that, I feel. But it's never not a doozy in your defense. Okay. For the first time in Sweet Valley High history, Elizabeth does not appear and Jessica does not appear. We have two non-twins.
Wait, did you forget about Racing Hearts?
Oh, I did forget about Racing Hearts. That's embarrassing. For the second time in Sweet Valley history. So this is just kind of Trisha staring off into space and Stephen looking like Clark Kent standing behind her in a blue and white striped polo with his hand on her shoulder, looking concerned. And it must be said, hot.
I really don't find him hot.
In this picture?
I don't know. Everything about him turns me off. I don't know how to explain it. He's just such a loser.
In this picture, if you didn't know it was Stephen, would you think like, oh, that's a cute boy?
Well, I'm trying to keep it real and honest with myself. You know, if I looked at this and I didn't know anything about the character, I would think the character was like a real jock. Because the shirt he's wearing is like striped in a sort of like rugby polo kind of way. He looks pretty buff on top. And
super
like,
buff on top.
I don't like his fluffy hair. I don't like his eyebrows are too intense for me. No, it's not.
It's not for you. That's great. It's good to know. It is very much for me. I mean, she does not look pretty, but that's kind of a mean thing to say about a dying girl. So maybe I should stop that.
Well, last week you thought Suzanne wasn't pretty enough either.
Maybe this is just like a kind of my like calibration is off because I'm so used to the twins' like unimaginable gorgeousness that like tell me what you thought I was going to say.
Because you're so used to looking at me. It's like you're looking at me on the screen. It's just like in comparison, anyone just looks so
sad. I will say, I mean, I think you're much more beautiful than Trisha.
Well, it's not really about that, but
okay. But like most of the covers for me, I'm like, ooh, I wonder what's going to happen. I'm interested. This one, I'm like, oh, who cares?
I wouldn't care about this one, but having read the story, I do find it interesting in a couple of ways that I would like to share.
Please.
My first thing when I saw her was she looks like a doll or a ghost.
Yeah, she looks like she's from a different time. I definitely react to that.
So one thing is she's wearing, you know, what Elizabeth might on a wild night out sort of put on a sort of Victorian laced up to the top button blouse. And her eyes are staring ahead in a way that I think this signifies so many things. Like, I actually think it's so rich. Like, number one, I think it signifies he's looking at her, she's looking ahead, right? Mm-hmm. He has his hand on her shoulder. Mm-hmm. They say grief is love's unwillingness to let go. And part of the reason she didn't want to tell him about the fact that she's dying is, I think there's a line where she says, it's just going to make him hold on tighter. And part of what this shows to me is like that there's a difference in where they're at in their sort of grief journey and acceptance of her dying, which naturally, because he's just learning about it. But I think we see sort of that she is on her way to or at sort of acceptance at some point. And I think her sort of looking ahead in that way and also having a little bit of a ghostly like feeling about her. It's gesturing towards that, orienting towards that space and preparing for death in a way that Stephen is not going to be ready to do yet. I find the cover sort of ambiguities in this way, both like so sad and also so beautiful, because like I think it speaks to so many of the ambiguities of loss, which is like, I'm going to cry. The idea of her looking like a ghost, like, or sort of looking like the life is out of her eyes in this, which I think a little bit is like part of what that implies is like, is she already gone? And at what point do you lose a person? And do you ever lose a person? And I think part of what I love so much about the title too is this, I think, theme of the title, When Love Dies. It's not if. It's not, the title isn't Dying Love. Like that would be a more typical Sweet Valley High title, right? Dying Love. True. But it's not, it's When Love Dies. And I think part of what that is indicating is, her prognosis is she has a few months or something like this, like 3-6 months, something like that. And it's happening, it's final. And the word love can refer to so many things. It can refer to love, like she is also his love, right? And she's dying in that sense. So when love dies, but also what they're both struggling with is this question of what to do with, where does love go when one of the people in love dies? Is there space for it? What do you do with it? And does that love die when the person dies? And I think one of the beautiful things about like grief is that, or loss, is that love doesn't die. And grief is love with nowhere to go. And if you can sort of reframe grief as just love that persists beyond that person being here, that love never dies. There's a beautiful line at the end of the book when Stephen says, like, I'll always keep loving you even when you're gone. Okay, you mentioned I'm a death doula. I do want to clarify that I'm not a practicing death doula as of this recording, but I am trained as a death doula with Home Hospice Association in Toronto. And one of the things I learned in my program, and something I've also like experienced myself, is that one effect of grief for the person who's dying can be like withdrawal or emotional isolation.
Of course.
And of course, like that's what we've seen Trisha do, is like turn away from Stephen. And so I guess I think that's also kind of a nice thing about the cover, is just the complexities of her facing away from him. Like it can mean that she's withdrawing, but it also can mean that she's like positively on acceptance to her own journey, and that he just sort of needs to like companion her that way.
You want to get into this book? So the book opens with Stephen and Jessica. Jessica comes upon Stephen. He is miserable. He is so kind of upset about stuff with Trisha that he literally can't see straight. He says, hi, Jess, as if it had taken him a second or two to tell which of his twin sisters was standing before him. He literally, Jessica like remarks, oh, he can't tell who's who. There's this moment. All of these books, for those of us who aren't reading along, all of the books are kind of standalone insofar as they have moments where they recap what happened in previous books, who these sisters are, etc. And the recap for who these sisters are in this book is especially egregious. Tempestuous Jessica seemed to attract trouble the way a magnet draws metal shavings, while the more level-headed Elizabeth spent a lot of her time trying to disengage herself from the results of her sister's mischief-making. Sure. Elizabeth tries to disentangle herself? Or is Elizabeth getting herself in there so there's something going on in Elizabeth's boring life? Like, let's be real.
Yeah, and then we get this, but at the moment, Jessica was honestly concerned about her brother. And I think it was in the previous book, or 2 books ago, we had another one of these. For once in her life, Jessica was being sincere. Yeah. And it's like, God forbid we're on page 2 and Jessica hasn't been absolutely undermined.
And it's like, just lay off her for a second.
I did die laughing at Jess telling Stephen he looks like Dracula's leftovers.
That is good.
Like, that is so funny. Not to overstate it here, but I think one of the other things that's interesting to me about this book is that before Stephen knows what's really going on with Trisha, and he thinks that she's just basically dumping him, he's having a lot of grief. And there's a lot of like, Jess says, you look like your best friend just died, and he looks like Dracula's leftovers. And he's, we notice on page 1, the fact that he literally can't see or is having like potentially cognitive impasse is a physiological symptom of grief. Sometimes is like things like that. And so it is interesting to see that, like, it's almost like, I don't want to say rehearsal, but I feel like there's a lot of like mirroring in that. What did you think about Jessica's like angry fruit peeling? I don't know, this whole scene of like Jessica and Elizabeth aggressively like battling vis-a-vis fruit, like she snatched a banana from the bowl, angrily yanked the peel off.
Well, it's not fruit fighting, they're fighting over a banana or around a banana. A banana is sometimes kind of like thought to be phallic in shape, or shaped like kind of a penis.
Like, wait, are you being real? Like, what, you really feel this represents something? Like, what penis are they fighting over?
Jeremy. They're not actually fighting over it, but there's like the kind of tussle.
A power play?
Yeah, it's like a power play.
Yeah, okay, good. I accept. I like that.
Thank you.
I forgot about Jeremy. Again, I'm so wrapped up in the Des and the Carl and the,
There's so much.
I can't hold all three. I cannot hold all three. We have a reiteration of Jessica's classism against Trisha, and kind of like she refers to her as worse than a nobody.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, I think, consistent theme of like Jessica defining who counts as a person and who counts as a somebody has been like a thing we've heard a lot.
And Jessica says, talk about humiliating. The Martins are just about the worst family in Sweet Valley. How could our own brother want to be seen with one of them? And I think this speaks a little bit to how Jessica approaches relationships. Like relationships are about being seen with someone, not about being with someone.
I mean, not to whatever, but of course.
Okay, thank you.
And then also very consistent on the, like, yeah, agree. Jessica's doing the things she does, and then Elizabeth does the things she does, which is on the next page. It's like she's defending Trisha, but at the same time that she did with Robin, that she did with Annie Whitman, while she supports these individuals, she still reifies the ideology that stigmatizes them, which is like, she says, Trisha's nice. She's not like the rest of their family.
She even says, come on, Jess, give Trisha a break. Her family problems aren't her fault. Which I thought was interesting because also it's like, wait, Elizabeth, so you think other people in your family's problems aren't their responsibility? Because you don't ever act like that, sweetheart.
Yeah, and Elizabeth has the nerve to say, I couldn't believe this, to say to Jess, all you can think about is being right. I died.
Yeah.
But just on the level of summary, basically what's happening is Stephen's moping about Trisha. No one knows what's going on with her. Jessica's saying, great, dump her, she sucks. She's probably cheating on you. She's trash, Elizabeth is, no, Trisha, nice and good. I support still Stephen and Trisha. We move to chapter 2. Stephen goes over to Trisha's. He's trying to find out what's going on. And it was only a few miles from the Wakefield's comfortable split-level ranch house and a beautiful green area of Sweet Valley to the poorer section of town where the Martins lived. But as far as Stephen was concerned, it was a completely different world. One thing I noted about this was like, what gives Stephen a pang of pain is the peeling paint on her house. And I'm just like, of all the things her family's been through, her mom died of leukemia. Her dad is struggling with alcoholism. She is now dying. He pulled to a stop in front of a shabby frame house with peeling paint. Trisha's house. As always, he experienced a pang at the thought. Sweet, lovely Trisha deserved much better than this, though he never once heard her complain about it. Like in book 1, when he supposedly like got over his sort of savior thing of her and like judgmentalness, he still is feeling those same ways.
Yeah, he sucks.
We meet Mr. Martin, who has the famous bad parent signifier of booze on the breath.
And he's slurring his words.
Yeah. But I did appreciate that we later got his backstory. We get Trisha described like a doll, as wooden, emotionless.
Yes, but there was nothing doll-like about the way her brilliant blue eyes leapt with fire or the quick, light grace of her movements. So she's kind of a doll and not a doll. Yeah.
Like, okay, Trisha's supposed logic is this. Let me bluntly dump Stephen and like let him think there's someone else or whatever, because yes, he's going to eventually find out I die. But if we break up now, he'll sort of gotten over his love for me enough by then that it won't hurt that much compared to if he knew and stayed with me and went through it that way, he like wouldn't be able to handle it kind of thing. That's her kind of reasoning apparently, right? And so she's sort of trying to encourage him to dump her. She says, look, you're away at college most of the time. There's probably lots of girls. He says, you're the only one I want. He protested brokenly, tears filling his eyes. Unless Trisha's head snapped back. A strange emotion blazed in her eyes. Unless what? I thought that was so interesting because how I interpreted that, I said, that strange emotion is jealousy. Because what she's experiencing here is because her expectation, of course, is he's going to resist, and I'm going to really have to convince him that we should break, right? And she correctly understands that he loves her very much and wants to be with him. Yeah. But so when he says, you're the only one I want, unless ... what he's saying is, unless you don't want me anymore, basically, right?
Right.
But in that ... but what she picks up on in that ... is something more coming from him, that he actually might have some of his own reason to want to leave her. And that makes her feel a strange emotion. And how I interpret that is like, that emotion is some sort of jealousy or disturbance in a way that like the same way she still has a fire in her eyes, even though she looks like a doll. And I think she's trying to be this like good dying person, which is like a stoic, self-sacrificing, I'm going to put on a brave front. And then we see these flashes of strange emotions.
I think there's also like, and you would know more about this than I would, but I feel like she's kind of grappling with the idea that like Stephen's life will continue after her untimely passing. And so she's kind of processing through in that moment, like the idea that like, oh, he is going to date someone else. Like he is going to marry someone else. He's not going to marry her. She's going to die. What was kind of abstract for her, where it's like, oh, we'll break up and I'll be saving him, is now like, oh, what if he's moved on? Like, oh, he's going to move on. He's going to date other people. Does that resonate at all?
Yeah. What I learned in my course is that grief begins at diagnosis for the dying person and their loved ones. And they're not only grieving the fact that they are dying, that includes grieving multiple things and dying many quote unquote deaths along the way of that journey. So you're grieving life as it was, relationships as it was, all your plans for the future, intimacy with your partner, all these things that you either already are losing or are going to soon, right? And so I think a lot of what she is grappling with in this book is these secondary kind of losses. So yeah, I think absolutely, like, even the possibility of him being with other girls may remind her that, like, oh, that will never happen for her.
And then we get the leukemia diagnosis. And I think this is pretty compelling and pretty interesting. Trisha basically reflects and says, I watched my dad fall apart as my mom died of leukemia. And now I watch my dad still dealing with this, quote unquote, dealing with it through alcohol. I don't want that for Stephen. So it like gives a backstory both to her dad and why her dad is such a drunk. And it gives a backstory to why she feels it's better for Stephen just not to know and to kind of have a clean break.
Her mother had always been so cheerful and full of smiles, but in the end, she had wasted away to a dull-eyed skeleton. And so no matter how sort of perfect and doll-like and pretty and porcelain and all these ways that she's described, she has seen what this looks like. She's seen the nitty-gritty of the months and weeks and days. She can picture it. She can picture wasting away to a dull-eyed skeleton, right? And that's the unromantic version of this. And that's heartbreaking. And these echoes of, like, it says her father had loved his wife so much that something in him died with her. And Stephen says, a part of me died.
It feels like a part of me is dying.
Yeah. And that was even before he knew. That was just about the breaking up, I think, right? Yeah. So sad. It says, knowing she'd lost him was nearly as terrible as knowing she was going to die. But when you loved someone, you had to sacrifice your own feelings for theirs. This was her sacrifice, her gift to Stephen, the last gift she would ever be able to give him. So her model of love, and I think this is the romance, right, is sacrificing yourself in these ways. I think in the end, she learns that version, the love story movie version, is not what is going to be helpful for both of them. Okay, we got to talk about Kara, because I got some things to say about Kara Walker.
Well, luckily, the next chapter opens. Kara Walker slid into the seat next to Jessica's just as the bus started up. Outside the white column facade of Sweet Valley High, with its Romanesque clock and sprawl of green lawns, swept slowly past. They ride the bus now?
Yeah, I was also very much like, oh my God. I mean, I think we talked with Jessica, like, I will take the bus or I could take the bus, but I don't think we've seen her take the bus.
It's quite jarring to see Jessica on a bus. I will tell you that right now.
Yeah, I had to read it like 20 times. It was like, does not compute.
Yeah. So what do you want to say about Kara Walker?
On the level of plot.
Thank you.
All right, Jessica decides to get up to some mess and take advantage of the fact that her friend Kara Walker has always had a crush on Stephen. Stephen may or may not be vaguely aware of this, whatever. And now Stephen has been sort of dumped. Like, we're now at the point where Trisha kind of dumped him and he still doesn't know why. And so Jessica's like, great, let me set up Stephen with Kara and everything will be good. And so there's like this ongoing plot where, like, they're trying to set up Stephen with Kara, and then he ends up being like, I don't care about Kara, I only love Trisha, whatever. But what I got to say about this is that it's another one of these fucking scenarios where it's described as Kara has her claws in him and we better save Stephen before this and that. And Jessica and Kara being so sneaky. Literally all they do is like invite him to a party at her house. It ends up being like there's only a few people there, and that's literally all they do. It's like he then he kisses her, he starts dating her, he takes her out, and it's like Elizabeth's like, I have to get Stephen out of her clutches. I'm like, you misogynistic pieces of shit. That it's again this like taking away total agency from him, that just because he's been dumped, he's allowed to fully use Kara. I think there might be a scene described of like he's kissing her, imagining Trisha. So it's very much what Bill Chase did to Jess, you know.
Aww.
And I'm sorry, but it just really offends me that we're hearing about like Jess and Kara always being these so getting their claws in them. It's like Stephen kissed her, pretending she was like someone else, and then totally like dumped her in this rude public way and like ran out with like no regard for her feelings and took absolutely no responsibility.
Yeah,
Fuck
I couldn't
him.
agree more. It sucks.
Oh, one more thing.
Of course.
We get the introduction of an iconic family, which you don't know yet, but they're called the Morrows, and they're
The
moving
Morrows.
to the biggest mansion, the most fabulous house in Sweet Valley, grander even than Fowler Crest, and everyone's a buzz. Everyone's a buzz. The father used to be a football player, and his name is Kurt. And I don't know if we know this yet, but the mother's name is Sky, and she was a big model in New York. And I can tell you about the kids too, but I'm not going to say anything.
No, you little spoiler. Well, we know that there's a girl who is our age. I mean, by our age, I mean Jessica and Elizabeth's age. Our age. Wow. I would like to not explore that any further. Thank you.
That was.
And then there's an older brother who they describe, I think, as being dreamy, even though they've never seen him. But I am excited to jump on that hog, if you know what I mean.
I mean, rich. These people are rich.
Oh, so rich. Porsche rich.
I'm just excited for their arrival. That's all I have to say about that.
I mean, you're preaching to the choir here, and all I can say is amen.
Okay, Jessica's trying to convince Liz to be candy stripers with her. Have you heard of a candy striper? What is your sort of mental model of a candy striper?
Yes, of course I've heard of a candy. Is this an American versus Canadian situation? Do you know the phrase candy striper?
Oh, I definitely do.
Oh, okay.
But I actually wonder if it's sort of like a old-timey thing that like...
Kids these days?
Yeah, because like when I was a kid and I read it, like this was my main reference for it. Like I sort of vaguely maybe heard of it a few other places, but it was not like a ubiquitous concept for me. Maybe I don't really know candy stripers.
So a candy striper is like a volunteer in a hospital who kind of helps out in an unpaid capacity. They might sit quietly by the bedside. They might offer comfort of a non-sexual nature, Jessica.
Water.
I'm sorry? Water, of course, is a huge part of being a candy striper and a huge part of this text. So yeah, that's kind of what a candy striper is.
But I have so many questions and I don't know why I didn't Google, but like just candy striper as like a social category. Like, is this like a term that has been used like in certain years in the United States? Is that still like an official role? Do they still call it that? Is it called candy stripes because your uniform is striped? Like, what is this? And then remember Enid was in a candy stripe bikini a few books ago and I said, clock that candy stripe. And you said, huh? Why? That's why.
Oh, I do think
there's no reason. There's no connection, no reason, but I just said it.
But clock it nonetheless, please. I do believe it's because the uniform is candy striped. I don't think they use that term anymore, but I don't know. I'm just kind of making
and like, what even does candy striped mean?
Oh, like red and white up and down. Okay.
All right. So Jess is trying to convince her they should be candy stripers, and Liz says, "I never expected you to be so interested in sick people." And then they go through the whole time she watched Love Story. And then for weeks afterward, Jessica had pretended to feel faint when a boy she liked came near in hopes that he'd think she had some romantic incurable disease. It ended the day she pulled her act on Tom McKay, and he commented nervously that he hoped whatever she had wasn't catching. And then Liz is like, I'm awfully busy with the paper. And then Jess goes, but this is our big chance to save lives.
Which it like absolutely is not.
But like that's such a it's such an insane thing to say. And then Liz basically is like, okay, fine. And then Mrs. Wakefield's like, I had a wonderful year when I was a candy striper. Ha ha ha. Her lithe tan body looked really good that day as usual.
Everyone in Sweet Valley who owned a television set knew who Jeremy Frank was. He was a host of a popular local talk show called Frankly Speaking. He also happened to be tall, dark, and gorgeous, with the bluest eyes to hit the screen since Paul Newman. Practically every girl in Sweet Valley had a crush on him. Jessica was one of the lucky few who had actually seen him. She'd spotted him coming out of a supermarket once and had nearly dropped her bag of groceries. He was even cuter in person. We get that introduction of the very sexual Jeremy Frank. In this, it's kind of a funny moment where Kara goes, did you hear what terrible thing happened to Jeremy Frank? It's so tragic. And
oh my God, I wrote this down. I die laughing at this moment. Go ahead.
Jessica goes, don't tell me he got married. She could think of no worse tragedy. Gosh, no, nothing as bad as that. He broke his leg. He's in the hospital. So that's why they need to be candy stripers in the first place, is because Jeremy Frank is there and he is her big chance.
Wait, we're introduced to the new battle axe. Remember Trudy?
Of course.
So now we have the like hospital version of Trudy, the like no nonsense person that gives Jessica tasks and like tries to stop her fun. Which like makes her clean dirty diapers, which is That's like not a regulation thing to do. Is have a candy striper be touching hazardous waste, biological waste?
What do you think babies poop out? Like, they're not pooping out hazardous waste.
No, but like, I don't know. I just think like they need a better system than like Jessica just like, no, that's not how it goes. I spend time in hospitals. I know how it looks of certain buckets or certain.
I know you know all about buckets. I'm certainly not saying you don't know about hospital buckets. I'm just saying, I don't think it's that weird.
I just don't think they're being so having diapers to and fro. Oh, let's just give it to this person. Like, move it. No, you need a system. Has to be to code. Certain people with certain PPE touching that is important.
Okay. This
So-
battle axe is named Mrs. Simpson, and it is important to note that she seems totally professional and totally fine. Like, she's framed as if she's a monster, but she absolutely is just like doing her job at the hospital.
Jessica daydreams about Jeremy Frank, imagining that he's holding a microphone in front of her and saying, "Tell us, Jessica, what's it like being a celebrity at the age of 16? But the next day she's disappointed to learn she's in a maternity ward.
There's this
But
hilarious moment.
Wait a minute. Miss North is the grim-faced woman who reminds Jessica of a Marine sergeant. Miss North is the one who's like, "Do you know anything about babies?" And Jessica's like, "Not exactly, except I used to be one myself." Jessica smiled disarmingly, hoping to win the head nurse over with a small dose of humor. Miss North did not find it funny in the least, and she glowered even more fiercely. "I hope you take your job seriously, Miss Wakefield, because I certainly do." Gives her garbage bag, dirty diapers, and yada, yada, yada. And then Jessica is so then put out because she has to spend the rest of the morning telling a bunch of women their babies are cute when she thinks they're ugly.
I do think that line that Jessica has, not much except I used to be one myself, I think it's actually a very funny line. I like that.
Yeah,
that would have won me over if I were a battle axe supervisor.
Same.
Obviously, Elizabeth is trying to double dip. She's working
Creating
as a
content.
candy striper, but she is creating content for the Oracle.
God forbid she should be present in any single moment of her life. And then she, of course, has all the luck and gets to meet Jeremy Frank and have a nice conversation with him. She signed his cast and just goes losing her shit. And Liz is just sort of casually detailing this for her.
And I feel like this is the banana play, so to speak.
Yeah.
Like, Elizabeth knows what she's doing. She knows that this is like hurtful and mean, and she's doing it anyways.
Okay, here's the paragraph. Once Jessica had a certain male in her sights, Elizabeth knew there was no stopping her. She would do anything to get him. In Jeremy's case, Elizabeth could certainly see the attraction. He was awfully cute. If she weren't so much in love with Todd, she might even be attracted to him herself. The other problem, of course, was that Jeremy was too old. Mid-20s at least. Their mom and dad would flip if they knew Jessica was chasing after a man that age.
I hate how this is positioned as if the only problem with one of them, a 16-year-old, dating someone, again, the floor is mid-20s. There is no ceiling for that age. The only problem is that their parents would flip out. It's like, no, your parents are flipping out because this is gross and inappropriate.
And it's probably statutory rape, depending on the laws in California at this time about age of consent. And then Liz is like, "You knew it, didn't you? You knew Jeremy Frank was here, and that's why you made me be a candy striper. But I guess I'm not actually Max. I actually like being candy striper and get to write articles. Oh my God, Mr. Conti be so proud of me." Again, we get Liz sighing, okay? Forget milk count. We should have done sigh count, because between Liz and Alice, sighs all day. Elizabeth sighed. Once again, she'd been had by her sister. Only one problem remained. She'd have to find a way of warning Jeremy that Hurricane Jessica was on her way. So at the level of plot, Elizabeth has revealed to Jessica the room that Jeremy's in. And that's what she means by that. And of course, now she is weaving a tale that sort of stars her as the one who must, stop Hurricane Jessica. And now she's going to have to do, I mean, when I say nonsense, the level of nonsense that she gets up to with Jeremy Frank is
far too much. We, of course, run into an orderly.
Can we read the paragraph?
Sure. Elizabeth was so wrapped up in her thoughts as she pushed her cart down the corridor that she didn't see the dark-haired orderly who had stopped to look at her. But she was alerted by the loud crash as the tray he was carrying slid from his grasp. Elizabeth rushed over to help him pick everything up. As she bent down, she noticed his hands were trembling. Poor guy. Maybe he was afraid of losing his job. Or maybe he was just embarrassed at appearing so clumsy. She smiled reassuringly at him. "Don't worry. It was just an accident. Anyway, I know what it's like. I'm always dropping things." The orderly was short and husky, about 25 or so, with a hawkish nose and the darkest eyes Elizabeth had ever seen. At that moment, they were fixed on her with an intensity that sent a rash of goosebumps skittering up her spine. Why was he staring at her like that?
I'm just curious, for a first-time reader, at what point were you like, abduction is imminent? I mean,
this moment.
Was it this?
This moment, I was like, oh, he is absolutely trapping her in a closet or doing something terrible.
But I mean, literally, was it at like a dark-haired orderly? Was it so clumsy, hands trembling? Was it rash of goosebumps on? Like, I'm
goosebumps.
Really,
it was goosebumps.
Right. So she has a gut instinct here, you know? And her, Elizabeth, something's telling her something in the milk ain't clean with this guy. And she is going to, I mean, what do we learn from this? It's so sad. What happens is she ignores her instinct. She knows he's a creeper because she feels it. Technically, has he done anything explicitly so bad? Not yet. But then when she's feeling creeped out later in the parking lot, and I know we're going to get to it, but like she gets in her car and he knocks on the window and tells her or whatever. And she gets out of the car, and that's when he abducts her. A lot of the problem in our society is that women and people are told not to trust our instincts around safety. And that's the whole thing of like not making men angry or like being nice to men or like, I don't want to disappoint him or like, what if that's awkward? It's like, no, she felt unsafe and like she should have got out of there.
You can even, something I think is really important is Elizabeth experienced a cold shock. As the man hurried off, she couldn't help thinking there was something strange about him. Or was it just her writer's imagination getting out of hand again? We always return to this idea of her writer's imagination and the idea that like this vocation that she has makes her prone to flights of fancy and believe things that aren't true, but everything she believes always is true. And for me, there's like kind of a strange moment where we always hear, of course, how Ned's lawyerliness is wrapped up in his logic. And I think there's like a misogyny and a patriarchy inherent in the fact that like Elizabeth's vocation makes her just like a quote unquote crazy, unreliable woman.
Yeah, like quote unquote, like women's intuition and stuff. 100%. I also think it's sort of funny that she's always talking about her quote unquote writer's imagination because she's not very imaginative and like all she does is write eyes and ears and boring columns about where to get a summer job. So let's chill. Then Elizabeth sees Trisha. She's like, I guess she's visiting a sick friend. And she's like, but she looks so sad too. But if she's the one who wants to dump Stephen, how come she's actually also looking sad? Then we get some physical comedy from Jessica.
Yeah, I mean, she goes to visit Jeremy Frank. Jeremy Frank is like, you were just here. Isn't it Elizabeth? You're thinking of my sister. She's Elizabeth. I'm Jessica.
Yeah, she is trying to sign his cast and then ends up hitting him and injuring him. And so she has to sort of fumble out of there and get the nurse and is embarrassed.
She stabs him with the pen that she's using to sign the cast. And he's unbelievably pained by this. Get a nurse. There's this funny moment where he's like, get a nurse. He croaked. A nurse, sure. I'll be right back. Don't go anywhere. Where would I go? He mumbled weakly. I mean, he's in a hospital bed. It's like kind of funny, no?
Then we get chapter 5, and Jessica is trying to orchestrate a little party, quote unquote, at Kara's for Stephen to come to. I'm not in the mood for a party, Stephen growled. Thanks, Jessica, I'll pass. I want to say I think there's some signs in this book of Stephen's anger issues.
Okay.
There's one scene, and it reminded me of the cover of his hand on her shoulder, where it was like he didn't realize how hard he'd been holding her. But it's like he's gripping her and shaking her or something like that. There's a few scenes of him like growling or yelling or like having a lot of rage. It was a bunch of little things. I just didn't like it. I didn't think it was cute. And he does it to a lot of people. I don't need him growling that he's not in the mood for a party. I'm sorry. No.
That's like
like
not
your
girlfriend's
your girlfriend dumped you. You don't need to growl at your sister and ask you to go to a party. I'm sorry. You're a college student. Like act like a person.
You do not need to apologize, Pardo.
Loser. The thing that supposedly finally gets Stephen to go to this little party at Kara's is that Jessica's like, I'll bet Trisha's not sitting home tonight. At the mention of Trisha's name, Stephen slammed his book shut and scowled up at Jessica. What makes you an expert on Trisha? And then Jessica's like, well, we've heard that she's, hanging out and being slutty and flunking or something. And then Stephen supposedly like is going to go to the party to just like find out more information about this or like grill Kara, who supposedly knew about like Trisha's been seen here and there, which is like so stupid.
Makes no sense. There's no reason for him to go to this party. He's giving the Beast from Beauty and the Beast in a way that I don't enjoy at all. Just a
and he's like,
scowling.
then he's like, I want to protect her. Okay, then, I mean, we have to talk about the Kara description at the beginning of chapter 6. Can we go there? So they sort of last minute tried to make a party happen. Only a few people show up. Hi, everybody. Hi, Steve. I'm really glad you could come. Kara greeted them at the door. She was wearing a splashy Hawaiian print halter dress. It was cut so low and back that Stephen could see the white lines from her bikini crisscrossing her dark tan. She had pulled her long brown hair into a ponytail over one ear so that it snaked seductively down her bare shoulder.
What?
I mean, this is disgusting. It's like they're making it as if snaked seductively. He is a college student. She is in high school. Get a grip. Like,
also, like, we get it. You're trying to invoke the Garden of Eden here, and like she is luring Stephen to a fall. But like, that is nothing.
And then again, with his rage, anger pounded in his temples, and his face grew hot at the thought of Trisha with someone else. Like, I'm sorry, Stephen has fucking issues.
There are resonances with Great Gatsby, with Jessica talking about the size of parties and which sizes of parties she likes best.
Okay, then of course we learn the name of our new Morrow girl.
Regina. I'm sure you spent a lot of time with that. When she's queen, she's going to be the new queen.
Well, you know what's interesting? Regina Morrow's name has been a journey for me in my life because growing up in Canada,
Regina?
One sort of default pronunciation of this word is Regina because of the town called Regina, Saskatchewan.
Of course.
And so my whole life, pretty much, I grew up thinking this girl's called Regina Morrow. And only in my adulthood have I had to train myself that when I'm reading the books about her, I've got to say it's Becky. It's okay, but it's Regina now. I've got to say Regina now. Don't be weird. Be normal. Because it sounds like vagina, and I don't want to think about that.
If you want to call her Regina Morrow, I'm fine with that. Regina Morrow, it sounds like a Bond girl.
Had you heard of Regina, Saskatchewan? Oh my God, I want to die every time I say it. It actually hurts. It hurts to say it. I have a sensory disorder where I can't. Okay, let's just keep it moving. Anyway, that's her name. She's having a party. So then Kara and Stephen are dancing. And again, no one coerced him. This is absolutely by his own agency. And then they're dancing and they're talking about the sort of rumors of Trisha at the pharmacy. And Stephen says, well, it's none of my business. Trisha can see whoever she wants. I couldn't agree with you more, Steve. Kara cooed. And Kara's just having the loveliest time with Steve. I mean, if she wants to hang all over some creep in public, what's it to me? Absolutely nothing, Steve. What are you getting so excited about? I'm not excited! He practically roared. Abruptly, he grabbed Kara's wrist, pulling her to her feet. Let's dance. I feel like dancing. To hell with Trisha, he thought, but that didn't stop his eyes from stinging with unshed tears. It's just gross.
It's gross. I do like imagining a world where toxically masculine men get super angry and they're like, let's dance. I like dancing. I've got so much pent up anxiety and anger and rage. I just want to move my body in time with this music. Wait, have we said that he kisses her? I think we've said it a couple of times, I guess. He kisses her.
Yeah, he's imagining Trisha. Suddenly, Stephen jerked his head forward and kissed Kara hard on the lips. Yeah. But he felt nothing. Cold inside, cold and dead. And Kara's just absolutely melting in his arms. Terrible.
And then we cut to Jessica coming home from the party. And of course, she has to say something gross about her brother. So she says, I hate to say I told you so. Steve didn't need much encouraging. He was all over Kara. And then they continue to kind of grossly report what's going on. I don't think we need to worry about Steve mourning over Trisha anymore. An interesting choice of words. He's probably forgotten her name by now. Steve didn't even come home with me. He and Kara must be off in some cozy place right this minute. It's just like gross.
Then Stephen and Ned have like a late night hot cocoa moment.
Well, we're going to talk about the cocoa.
I mean, I honestly don't have anything to say about the cocoa. Just Steve and Ned had cocoa, and then Mr. Wakefield is trying to be a parent, and he like puts a hand on his son's shoulder. Want to tell me about it? And Stephen felt a rush of warmth. There's a kinship between them that went much deeper than their physical likeness. Yeah, I fucking hope so.
They're talking about how Jessica invited him to a party and blah, blah, blah.
I have that.
His father nodded sympathetically. I think I get the picture. Just one word of advice. I know your sister means well, but don't let her push you into anything you're not ready for, okay?
Disgusting. Jessica needs to be emancipated. Yeah. Okay. And she needs to sue these people. Yeah. Okay. They are
Wild.
How dare you, Mr. Spears? You had me fooled. And you too, Mrs. Spears. Death to all of them.
By the way, another just thing that occurred to me that I want to say is, at some point, like Trisha says, like, the reason she doesn't tell Steven initially is she thinks he's gonna have a really hard time with it. He won't be able to accept it. He's gonna hang on even more tightly, right? And I started to think, like, where does she get that impression? And it is interesting to me that she was around, although maybe not as present, during the whole time of Elizabeth's motorcycle accident and coma. And she may have witnessed some of the death-denying beliefs or behaviors or words from the family. Like when Alice told Jess, like, we won't let her die and all this type of stuff. You know, Stephen was obviously around during that time. And like, there's probably a pretty good chance that Trisha was exposed to some of these conversations. And so she probably accurately assessed that, like, these people do not accept the possibility of death or the likelihood of death.
That makes perfect sense to me.
Chapter 7.
We have Elizabeth coming upon Trisha at school. Trisha's alone. They have the very briefest of conversations. Elizabeth clocks that something's up. And then after maybe 15 seconds or 30 seconds of conversation, Elizabeth gets up and then thinks to herself, wishing there was something more she could do, but not knowing what, Elizabeth stood up and brushed loose bits of grass from her jeans. Well, I guess I better get going. Todd will wonder what happened to me. And it's just so interesting to me when Elizabeth has like the capability to meddle and when she doesn't. Like most of this book is Elizabeth meddling where it doesn't belong and where it doesn't matter. Whereas here would be a moment of intervention that would be totally appropriate. Like, just keep talking to her. Be a sympathetic ear, an eye and ear, if possible.
Yeah. And then, you know, we talked about physical symptoms of grief. And certainly a lot of Trisha's symptoms, I think, can be from her illness and from her medications. She's experiencing everything together, like all these different symptoms, right? So she couldn't stop the cold feeling in her chest, as if an icicle lay wedged alongside her heart. She couldn't seem to stop the tears either. They dripped silently onto the backs of her hands, clasped tightly into her lap. The drugs she was taking sometimes made her sick to her stomach. But she wasn't sick now, just tired and very, very cold. She shivered in the warm sunlight, hugging her arms. She felt so alone, so desperately alone. And I think what's happening partly with her is, remember we talked about Bill trying to break, B-R-E-A-K, his grief? I think Trisha's also going back and forth between moments where she allows herself to feel these feelings and think these thoughts and cry versus trying to stop it. And we get a couple of moments of, I don't want to say self-harm, but there's two moments that stood out to me where she physically induces small amounts of pain to herself. Did you notice this? One is she bites her lip so hard that she tastes blood, just from the stress. And then another is she digs her fingernails so tightly into her arms that she claws, like something like that. I think that could be read a lot of different ways. What is feeling it might be for me is her trying to replace the emotion with that or control the emotion somehow with that.
That makes sense.
But then now she gives into it. She knew these were dangerous thoughts. She couldn't seem to stop them. She was unable to stop her tears. Images of Stephen flashed to her mind. She saw them running along the beach, the wind whipping through her hair. They had run until they were out of breath and tumbled into the sand. She thought of him arriving at the house to pick her up on their first date, greeting her father courteously, even though he was so drunk. She remembered the first time he kissed her and his thumb on her cheek. She was trembling so hard she thought she wouldn't be able to stand up when it was all over. Steve, I can't bear to lose you. Without you, I'm already dead. And then she bit down so hard on her lip that she could taste blood. And that's in order to stop herself from telling him. Let him go, the voice of reason. Again, what type of knowledge is valorized? Whispered in her ear, if you love him, let him go. It was better this way. And then the saddest line of the book for me, and one of the most powerful, the last line of this chapter, he would forget about her. That was the way it should be. He would be happy again. And soon it wouldn't matter to her either, because in a few months she would be gone. So heartbreaking, so powerful. What all of this and what that line does, I think, very well is show these paradoxes of part of the reason it's so hard to get people to think and talk about dying, and in particular to think about and figure out their wishes and plans. There's so many reasons, but one of them is a lot of people have this first reaction of, I'll be dead, I won't care. So there's this almost logical paradox of like, how do we think about what we want for after we're dead? What does it mean to have wishes for after you're dead? How do we even hold that in our heads? And so Trisha sort of reckoning with like saying like it won't matter because I'll be gone.
Yeah.
It's so huge and it's so heavy and heartbreaking.
It's truly, truly heartbreaking. They're
We
worried.
start chapter 8. Elizabeth says something in the milk ain't clean.
Yep.
Oh no, I hate this. Todd's trying to have a sense of humor. I couldn't. Elizabeth's like, you're hilarious. He's like,
but where was the hilarious? Where I don't
exactly. No,
okay.
literally. She goes, something strange is going on. Todd looked up from his hamburger.
Oh,
That
yeah.
sounds like the opening of a mystery novel. His brown eyes sparkled with mischief. This is Todd at his most mischievous. Any clues so far, Sherlock?
Come on, Todd. I'm serious.
But she couldn't resist a smile. Todd was such a kidder. His sense of humor was one of the things she loved best about him. We will get to the next part in a second. But that gave me the kind of rage that Stephen is sort of feeling, which is like, for that to be him being mischievous and having such a sense of humor and she can't help but smile. I think Elizabeth is kind of gay too. And I want to talk about that.
I always want to talk about that.
But can we just take a moment? Sorry. I was thinking about this when I was brushing my teeth.
Of course.
Last night. All right. We've established she and Todd have a pretty de-sexed relationship. Yeah. We've talked about like, what might this serve? Okay. So Todd being gay, right? And we've talked about, and I think I have strongly advocated for also reading that like related to Elizabeth's mother wound, she is sort of seeking a womb experience in Todd. And like a lot of what she finds in Todd is like safety and warmth and also like emotional attention. So there's that. Fine. We've talked about it.
Of course.
But then what made things add up for me that way to say, we've now seen 3 or 4 moments where Elizabeth, in the face of a beautiful woman, has turned into a puddle. And we have attributed that to either sort of being threatened or jealousy vis-a-vis Todd. And I wonder if this may be and or also there. So for example, the examples I'm thinking of is number 1, when Mandy Farmer got off his bike. So when he shows up with the bike and Mandy Farmer, and it's her loose black hair shook and she was wearing Elizabeth's pink helmet and she had a shapely body. And we're like, okay, Elizabeth's jealous because she wasn't someone else to fuck Todd, right? Which I think is the reading. And she's shaking. Then with the introduction of Patsy Weber, and also Patsy Weber is so gorgeous that Elizabeth like loses her shit and she like is totally thrown off, can't talk, this and that, whatever. And then we get it again with Suzanne and Too Good to Be True, where Elizabeth is like mumbling, can't talk, can't breathe, shaking, etc. of like how gorgeous she is. And like those things combined made me think, what is really getting Elizabeth the same way we keep track of her size, let us keep track of the time when she shakes, because it's often in those type of situations. And I just wonder.
Okay. I love this. I'm here for kind of any kind of queer readings of these texts. And I mean, it's there. You're not doing much work. It's happening. We cut to Jessica back at the candy striper position. And this, listeners, is truly, truly wild. She goes by Jeremy's room. She sailed into the room, prepared to win Jeremy over. She glanced toward the bed, frowning slightly as she noticed the nurse standing over him. But she put on her most dazzling smile and continued forward anyway. Jeremy had to see her at her best. Jessica came up alongside the nurse and froze in her tracks. Jeremy was stark naked. The nurse was giving him a sponge bath, and there he lay without a stitch on. Jessica gave a little yelp, and the pitcher in her hands tipped forward, dumping ice-cold water on Jeremy's bare stomach. Jeremy roared in pain, nearly hitting the ceiling. He tried to sit up, but his broken leg was suspended too high, and he could only flop helplessly from side to side while the nurse made a frantic attempt to mop up the spillage with her towel. Finally, Jeremy managed to point a finger at Jessica and choke, "Ew!" The nurse glared at her. "What are you doing in here? Are you trying to give this man a heart failure?" I was only trying to help," Jessica stammered. "Help!" both Jeremy and the nurse echoed in unison. With an injured cry, Jessica turned and fled the room. Did they have to get so upset over a little water? It wasn't her fault, was it? How could she have known it would turn out this way?
The word, I mean, what was sort of imprinted in my psyche and will never leave was he could only flop helplessly from side to side. That was just sort of on a loop for me the past kind of 3 days. He could only flop helplessly from side to side. He could only flop helplessly from side to side. He could only flop helplessly from side to side while the nurse mopped up the spillage. Forget slippage. is about spillage.
Oh, this was spillage.
Yeah.
could only flop helplessly.
That's insane. Flop helplessly side to side. Like that is, I think that's the most insane thing we've seen in these books. Am I wrong? Has there been something crazier?
I mean, the fact that the door is open while the nurse is giving him a naked sponge bath and she could just walk in also feels pretty insane, right?
Yeah.
And then the nurse immediately blames Jessica, but it's like, hey, maybe you should have locked the door before you stripped down this celebrity sex symbol and like sponged him lovingly while he flopped side to side.
Then Jess tells Liz what happened, and Liz gets into her whole sort of narrative of, oh God, well, I guess I'm being dragged into this again. Guess I gotta freaking do something. What can I do? Threats won't work. Threatening her is like a red flag in a bull. Anyhow, Elizabeth comes up with the most deranged scheme I've ever heard of, and she should really leave the scheming to Jess because this is
What is her scheme? For our listeners who may not have read along with us, what's
her scheme is well, listen, basically reverse psychology in the form of harassment. So her scheme is to collude with Jeremy Frank to sexually harass Jessica to the point where Jessica will be turned off. And then she'll leave him alone. Supposedly, the problem to be solved is that Jessica won't leave Jeremy Frank alone. This is the problem that Elizabeth is solving. Jessica keeps doing this chaos and knocking things over and getting to Jeremy Frank. Elizabeth must get involved. There isn't a whole roster of licensed professionals that can sort of manage Jeremy's care that probably have ways to do this, but Elizabeth needs to get involved because I guess the risk is that, I don't know, Jessica will poke him again or slip on some water again. And so she tells Jeremy, how about you tell her you're in love with her and obsessed with her and all this stuff. And then at the beginning, she'll think it's great. And then she'll be like, no, thank you. And she'll end up going of her own volition. Jeremy's like, great idea. We have to, an adult celebrity,
right?
Think that this
is truly batshit. I do want to push back. You say the plan is for Jeremy to sexually harass her. The plan is for Jeremy to like reciprocate her romantic intentions. I don't think it rises to sexual harassment. Does it?
Given that he's an adult in his mid-20s and she's 16, I think it is something. And then him being like, I want to marry you. Whatever it is, it's not kosher.
Right.
I don't know what the legal, I would maybe need to get a lawyer in here. Not Ned.
Oh, not Ned, fine.
But
I just love his lawyerly logic.
Well, why don't we go to the text and we can see how bad it is.
Yeah. Okay. But I do just want us for a moment. We are being asked to imagine in this book that a very successful mid-20s celebrity is approached by a 16-year-old girl who says, my sister is obsessed with you, and the only way to get rid of her is for you to pretend to be obsessed with her too. And we're supposed to believe that this guy says, okay, sure, if that's the only way to deal with it, I'll deal with it that way. Like, it truly boggles the mind.
And the problem is, in terms of for our ability to talk about it, it's insane for so many reasons that it's like, if we start, we'll never stop. It's like, where to begin? From the perspective of sort of the PR kind of strategy, it's a problem for him. There's just so many.
Yeah.
But yeah, basically Elizabeth's logic is, she thought about all the times Jessica had a big crush on some guy, and the minute he started paying attention to her, she began seeing all his flaws. If Jeremy made a big play for her, Jessica might cool off in a hurry.
We do have a very brief additional Carl moment. Carl again looks at her creepily, and she freaks out. She quickens her step. She could feel his gaze burning into her back. She fought the impulse to break into a run. This is really silly, she told herself. Lux never killed anyone. What could he possibly do to her? Come on.
I hate this. It's so upsetting. It's like she was almost certain it was Carl, but it made her nervous. And then it says, even so, she made an attempt to be friendly. Ugh. That's that thing of like, women are socialized to make men comfortable at the expense of our own security. All right.
Jeremy gives Jessica roses. There's this gross moment where Jessica says to Elizabeth, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking he's too old for me. I'm only 16 and he's at least 25. But everyone knows girls mature faster than boys. It's a fact. And it's like, we don't have time to get into this, but we all know.
I do think there's a reading here where Jess is expecting Liz to play a role that she doesn't, and that sort of throws Jess off. Where, like, I think, because usually when Jess knows Liz well enough to know that, like, when she tells her something like, I'm going after a guy in his mid-20s, or I'm dating a guy who's super older, or like something like this, like, Elizabeth's not going to be supportive of that, right? And so when Jess goes, like, everyone knows girls mature faster than boys, it's a fact, and Liz says, absolutely, Jessica frowns. Jessica frowned. Of course, mom and dad won't see it that way. They probably forbid it. Usually Elizabeth, like, she expected Elizabeth to say, mom and dad will forbid it. You know, she's not blind. She's going to see that, right? And so when she doesn't say that, and then Jess is like, so that's why I'm counting on you not to breathe a word of it to them. So I think Jessica sort of, there's something there where she relies on the delimiting in a way that creates a sort of feeling of safety net a little bit for her or something.
She needs Elizabeth to try to throw a wrench in her plan so that she can, like, maneuver around it or whatever. But there is no wrench, and so there is very limited need for maneuvering.
Yeah, and Liz is like, my lips are sealed. Jessica stared at her. You mean it? You really won't tell them?
Then Elizabeth goes back and visits Jeremy, and they talk about, they have a code word, which is the hurricane, which is what they call their plan for Jessica. I just don't get it. I guess one story I could tell myself is that, like, Jeremy is bored at the hospital, and so this is something to do.
It's the only explanation.
But it's like, bruh, you're too old for this. This is weird.
Then finally we get Elizabeth finds out about Trisha because someone tells her, or Jeremy maybe tells her, there's a sick girl her age in one of the rooms and maybe she wants someone to talk to. So Elizabeth goes to give this person company and sees it's Trisha, realizes there never was a sick friend. Trisha is sick.
She's as pale as death. Trisha tells her, but says, you have to promise not to tell Stephen. Promise me. She does promise. We have more ghostly resonances where it always feels like Elizabeth is everyone's only friend, or the only one they can trust, or the only one who can know something. So we get that again here.
Wait, also, sorry. Just again, like, Trisha's repression. Tears fill her eyes, but she struggles not to give in to them. She keeps her lips tightly clamped and swallows hard. A single tear escaped. And then Elizabeth says, how bad is it? And Trisha says, I'm not going to get better. Trisha, no. So Elizabeth's first response to the fact of death is denial. Anyway, but I do think she accepts it reasonably quickly.
Yeah. I think it's, like, pretty normal, pretty developmentally appropriate to be like, oh no. Like, I mean, I see your reading certainly, but I also think that, like, if someone says I'm dying, like, oh no, is, like, a pretty reasonable response.
Yeah, the same way if I came out of a coma and you were like, Carter, are you awake? And I said, Robert, that would be a reasonable response. Yeah, I mean, what are we doing here?
We are certainly not doing anything reasonable.
Then Trisha says living without love is worse than dying. And that I think is the sort of romantic, quote unquote, version that she's trying to live by that she doesn't believe. Again, just about Elizabeth's freezing up. Elizabeth was too choked up to speak. There was so much she wanted to say. She wanted to tell Trisha how sorry she was and how glad she was to know her, but she couldn't seem to get the words to come out of her mouth. Trisha seemed to have read her mind. Please don't feel sorry for me. It was terrible when I first found out. I didn't want to believe what the doctors were telling me, but it's not so bad anymore. I've accepted it. It's strange, but whenever I used to think about the dying, it scared me. I thought it was the worst thing that could happen to anybody. And it isn't, asked Elizabeth. No, Trisha said, living without love is worse than dying. And then Trisha also we see is, like, bearing the burden of, like, her family hasn't accepted it yet. Which is so sad because it's like Trisha doesn't have any support really. Right? Like, she doesn't have anyone to grieve with or to support her experience. Like, she says her family is still talking about cures. Deep down they know, but it's a hard thing to admit. Yesterday I caught Papa looking through an old album of my mother's pictures. I could tell he'd been crying. It's just so sad. And then sorry, at the end of chapter 9, for the first time in her life, Elizabeth realized how final the word goodbye could sound.
Very sad. She comes home, she talks to Jessica. She's in misery because she feels like she shouldn't be keeping this secret, but she has to keep this secret.
Yeah, a classic sort of Liz internal conflict.
Who can she tell? Who can she tell? But she can't tell Enid, so she's still stressed about who can she tell? Who can she tell? Of course, the only person she can tell is
that hottie who sits on the edge of a desk.
Sit on that desk, baby boy.
And
that is Mr. Collins. Sorry. For our listeners who may not track the thousands of characters in these texts, that's Mr. Collins.
I wrote down he actually did perch on his desk this time. Enid is supportive. Like, she doesn't tell her the details of the thing, but she tells her in some vague level that she's dealing with keeping a secret, and Enid tries to give her good advice. I don't know. Enid's always there.
Yeah. Mr. Collins is basically like, you shouldn't keep the secret.
Oh, I wrote at the end of chapter 10, when Elizabeth's like, who can I tell? Who can I tell? Who can I tell? I wrote in huge letters, Sylvia Green, a million question marks. It would be a perfect person to go to at this moment.
Sylvia Green, of course, is the guidance counselor at Sweet Valley High.
Then
but instead, she goes to the hottest boy she knows.
And Collins is like, can you tutor Max, who's one of the droids musicians? Can you tutor him in English? And Elizabeth's like, sure. And then she starts crying and like tells him the whole story about Trisha and the dilemma.
And then he just says, you should tell Stephen.
Oh God. Then Jeremy Frith like proposes to Jess.
But I'm only 16. A very mature 16. Besides, why should age stand in the way of true love? Think of Romeo and Juliet, both of whom die. Jessica was totally panicked. I can't get married. I haven't even finished high school. He says, I'll wait.
Jessica runs out with sort of a muffled cry, and then Elizabeth and Jeremy like chuckle about it. I'm just like, what the f-?
Stephen goes to a dorm party with Kara. He takes her. Nothing interesting happens. He's still fighting with, like, do I think about Trisha? Do I think about Kara? Do I think about Trisha? Do I think about Kara?
Elizabeth thinks, was Stephen going to lose himself in Kara's relentless campaign to win him over?
Kara and Stephen are dancing, and Kara kind of, I think, pretty innocently says, like, if we're going to be a couple, and Stephen's like, wait a minute. What's this about us being a couple? And he like freaks out and gets super angry and is screaming and yelling, screaming about how much he loves Trisha. And it's like, I mean, in Kara's defense, she hasn't done anything truly terrible. She's just like, we've been making out and you take me to parties. Like, are we a couple or not?
Truly terrible? She hasn't done anything wrong. The worst thing she did was sort of let him believe she was having a party, like more people over than she was. Like, come on. No, tell me one other thing she's done. Bad thing. What?
If you're going to be with me from now on, I don't want you thinking about her. It seems a little not great.
Well, he's obsessing over her. She can obviously feel the reality that he's not actually really attending to her. I think she's intuiting the real problem there.
I think she is.
And he's like, do you think I could replace Trisha just like that?
Yeah, he's screaming and yelling.
As if she were a car. I loved her. His voice growing louder, rising above the din of the music. I still love her. He's such a piece of shit. And then he like runs away.
Meanwhile, Jessica is doodling in her notebook, and she has decided that she is going to accept Jeremy's proposal. She's not going to marry him. She's going to accept the proposal and kind of milk that for fame and fortune.
Also known as the biggest housewives move ever.
Ooh.
Okay. Being engaged for the purpose of being engaged and then never getting married just to like have the jewelry and get attention is huge.
And totally awesome.
I'm the one that's walking down the aisle again. When is your wedding? When's yours? It'll be soon.
They just have kind of like an awkward intervention. I will say at this moment, so they're at the hospital at night.
Wait, I want to say something.
Of course.
What's awesome about this storyline with how Jeremy ends is like he finally tells her like it was a joke, and then she's sort of crying, and he's like trying to console her. You know, if you were older, it would be different. And she's like, I guess you're right, and he goes, I'd like to make it up to you. She sniffled, dapping at her dry eyes with a corner of the sheet. Maybe there is a way. And that's how she gets a gig on his TV show, which is fucking awesome. Okay. She started this whole hijinks to try to like, she thought he was going to just like be so enamored with her that he casts her or brings her on his show or something. And then out of this whole ridiculous hijinks where he and Elizabeth made an absolute fool of her, she is so smart. And as we always talk about, so nimble that she fake cries, dabbing a corner of a thing, also a housewives move, at a dry eye to manipulate him to give her this. I mean, so well done. Brilliant. Wonderful. I loved it.
10 out of 10, no notes. Elizabeth tells Stephen about Trisha. Stephen gets super, super, super upset. He goes to Trisha's house.
He tells her he knows.
They hug each other.
Her legs wouldn't support her anymore. Uttering a strangled cry, she collapsed against Stephen.
And then they cry and they cry and they cry and they're holding each other and they love each other. And she doesn't feel so afraid anymore. She feels stronger, like she can face anything, even death.
So then Elizabeth, then it rains. Okay. So we know something's up when it's raining.
Yep.
The sky's overcast when Elizabeth leaves the hospital. She's thinking about Steve and Trisha. She's so absorbed in her thoughts, she doesn't notice a short, husky figure in a white orderly's coat. His rubber-soled shoes, creepy, made no sound as he tailed several yards behind Elizabeth. Carefully, he skirted the puddles, prepared to duck behind one of the parked cars if Elizabeth should turn. Can I ask you a question? Who would play her?
Elizabeth?
Like Carl. I'm saying who would play her in the sense of like Trixie and Katya always say that like they always say that like when RuPaul would do those like tic-tac conversations, you know, that they'd be like talking about their families or like they'd be like, yeah, I grew up like this, my mom like this, whatever. And RuPaul would always be like say they're talking about their mom. Like RuPaul's question pretty much in every scenario was just like, who would play her? And so Trixie and Katya, whenever they're just like sometimes they'll just be like talking about random people and they always go, who would play her? So I was kind of wondering like who would play her with Carl. I had two thoughts. I'm curious if you like who would you cast for Carl? My first was Jackie Earl Haley.
That's a name I've certainly never heard. Jackie
Oh.
Earl Haley?
Am I getting that wrong? The guy who played the creep in Little Children?
No, you're
That's
absolutely
cool.
That is his name. I've never seen him before.
And then the other guy I'm thinking of who would play her is an actor whose name I don't know, but his face I have in my head. I can't tell you what he's been in, but I feel like he's played a creep in a lot of stuff. He has dark hair, eyebrows, like a big straight nose, and the eyebrows very close to his head, like kind of, you know what I'm talking about? White guy. Do you have any feelings on who would play her?
No, she seems creepy. I don't want to tar anyone with that brush, so to speak.
All right, she keeps getting creeped out and ignoring her instincts. The wind is blowing, it's chilly. She has her scarf wrapped around her neck. She slipped in behind the wheel and was turning the key in the ignition when she heard someone tapping on the window. Startled, she looked up. Dark eyes peered in at her. Her heart jumped into her throat. Then she saw it was only Carl. She rolls down the window and he says, like basically someone from the hospital wants to see her and she has to go back in. She was confused. She had just spoken to the woman. Like, why didn't she mention it? She shrugged and got out of the car.
That was when Carl leapt at her and clamped his hand over her mouth to stifle her scream. A fountain of terror rose in her. She struggled fiercely, torso twisting, legs flailing. But it was no use. Carl's grip was like iron, the pressure against her mouth unyielding.
And then we get this broken palindrome. Go.
The only thing she managed to accomplish was to bite her own lip. Tears welled in her eyes as she tasted her own blood.
Isn't that interesting?
It is interesting.
And then he's like whispering like a creep in her ear.
I'm sorry, Elizabeth. I promise I won't hurt you. I just want to be with you. The two of us. Forever. Forever? What is he talking about? Elizabeth gave a sharp yelp that was muffled by his hand. Bright dots of color swam before her eyes. Her struggles were growing weaker. He was too strong for her. She couldn't fight him. The arm that was pinned across her chest slid away as Carl reached into his pocket for something. Before Elizabeth could lash out, a soft, wet cloth was jammed against her nostrils. A sickish, sweet smell enveloped her. Chloroform. She tried not to breathe in, but she couldn't help it. Waves of dizziness crashed over her. Her arms and legs felt very heavy. A moment later, Carl was dragging her toward the Chevy van. Through the haze that wrapped itself around her like layers of gauze, Elizabeth heard a click, then the back door opening. Carl lifted her sagging frame in his arms and placed her down gently on the mattress that was inside. He paused to smooth away a wisp of hair that was stuck to her cheek. Then the door slammed shut, and she could hear him walking around to the driver's door. Gotta get up. Gotta get away, Elizabeth thought, her brain still sending out feeble panic signals. But she was so tired. Her head was spinning. Her arms and legs wouldn't budge when she tried to move them. When she opened her mouth to scream, only a tiny squeak emerged. It was like one of those nightmares where everything was in slow motion. Where is he taking me? She wondered as the van's engine came to life. Then everything went black. Elizabeth's last thought, as she slid into unconsciousness, was that this was no nightmare. This was real.
Will Elizabeth be saved? Find out in Sweet Valley High number 13, Kidnapped. Do you have anything to say about the cliffhanger or anything else?
I mean, I just want to say I do feel bad for them because it is hard to have some level of suspense when there are another 3,000 books following this. So, like, will anyone save Elizabeth? Certainly.
Yeah, kind of like your sister.
Very much like your sister.
Thanks for listening to Sweet Valley Hive, hosted by Robert Marks and Rebecca Pardo. For more, check out our Instagram at Sweet Valley Hive. Theme song by Yessie and artwork by Elliot Carroll.